All right, well, thanks everyone. Yes, I'll be talking about the work that I'm doing with the data models team at Principles of Intelligence. And I thought I would start by giving some intuition as to why the concept of data models in general is interesting. So I think the core idea here is captured in this blog post from a couple years ago by James Betker, who's a researcher at OpenAI, where he argues that the it in AI models is the data set. That if you have, at large scale, a very powerful AI system, large neural network, trained to convergence, its behavior is not going to be determined by the specific details of the architecture, hyperparameters, or optimizer choices, but by the data set, nothing else, and everything else is a means to an end. And so the intuition here is that by understanding the patterns in data, we can gain insight into what's going on inside a powerful AI system. And so the thesis here is that data models could be a way to help enable ambitious interpretability. And so some of the questions that I'm interested in asking are, what are the structural properties of natural learning tasks? I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that in a bit. Can we develop principled toy models to capture these essential properties? And then use those models to have studies, say, of interpretability, and to gain insight into how the scale-dependent features that we want to find with interpretability might be related to properties of the data. And in particular, the goals here are to develop toy models that capture these properties and instantiate them into synthetic data sets, and then use those to validate and improve AI interpretability tools. So in the first part, I'll say a bit about the concept of data structure before diving into the specific model that I'm working with. And so the idea here is that real-world data are very high-dimensional, that there might be thousands or millions of tokens in a prompt or pixels in an image, or in general input features in some input sample that we want to understand. And if we have a function that all we assume is continuous, then it's a property that the loss that we get on the data will scale with an exponent that's inversely proportional to the dimension of our data. And so if our data is very high dimensional, then this exponent is going to be very small, so the loss will be effectively constant. So learning is intractable, machine learning is impossible, human learning is impossible, and we should all go home. But of course that's not true, but this is a central mystery in machine learning, and the answer that we think explains this, why is learning possible, is that real data sets have some structure to them that make them possible to efficiently learn. And the structure in data reflects structure in the world. And in turn, if we train an AI system to predict the data well, its internal representations should reflect the structure too. So I'll say a few words about what kinds of structures that people think exist in data sets, and how and where the structure acts. So there's a few different types of structure that people usually associate with natural data. First, we have sparsity. That's a very common assumption in interpretability, that the latent features that generate data sets occur, there's many of them, they each occur rarely, they co-occur rarely. We also think that there's power laws or heavy tails associated with data in many ways. For example, these sparse features, they might not be distributed uniformly, but those common features occur far more frequently than the typical feature. Something we're especially interested in exploring is hierarchy, that the concepts or variables explain data have sub-concepts and sub-sub-concepts and so on in a nested hierarchical form. And finally, this idea that data might be concentrated on some low dimensional subspaces, or usually thought of as a manifold. And so for this reason, only a certain part, a much smaller amount of the data can actually be realized. And so these are these four properties: sparsity, power laws, hierarchy, low dimensionality, that are different ways that data might be learnable and that we might want to capture in a toy model. So that's what sorts of structures there are. We can also ask how the structure will decrease the dimensionality of our learning task. So here in this diagram, this big box represents like our input, which is of some high dimension, lowercase d. One form of structure that we could have, we might call intrinsic structure, where the data are intrinsically low dimensional. And so a classic example here is on the upper left, where the data on the left are on a 2D disk, uniformly distributed. On the right, it's naively two-dimensional still, but actually the data are all embedded on a 1D manifold, a circle. So this is intrinsically one-dimensional problem. We can also have what I call invariant structure, where the data might be of some dimension, but we only care about some subset of those dimensions for any realistic task due to some invariance property or symmetry, for example. And so, for example, here on the right, even though the data are on this 2D wavy object, we only care about one dimension of the variation. So there's effectively only one dimension. And finally, there could be special properties of a target function that make it especially easy to learn. It could be especially smooth, for example. And so that's a third form of data structure. And typically, in the rest of the talk, I'll be more thinking about the first two forms and assuming that the functions that we learn are effectively generic. So finally, we might want to ask, where does the structuring happen? And there's a few different spaces that we might associate with a learning problem. So on the left is the input space. And so here this represents an actual input sample. So the axes are what we might call the spatial dimensions. So if this is an actual image, this is a 2D image. If it's like a natural language, that would be a one-dimensional input. A video would be three-dimensional. And each point in the input space is like one input feature or one pixel in an image or something like that. In the middle, we have the data space. So now the axes of the data space are the input features. So if in this example, this is like a 16 pixel image, this data space would be a 16-dimensional space. And each point in the data space would correspond to one particular input sample. So like each point in the data space is one entire sample from the input space. And we can color each point in the data space by some target that we want to predict, that it forms our learning problem. And so here, like the red and blue represent some labels that are applied to the data. And finally, we can also think about the function space, where we do the same thing. Now the axes of the function space, each one represents one particular sample, so one point in the data space. And then a point in the function space represents some labeling over an entire data set, entire data distribution.
So in the sample, what is the other axis? Sample.
Each axis of this function space corresponds to one sample from the data distribution. So if the data distribution consists of 1,000 samples, then this would be a 1,000-dimensional space. And so we can use this breakdown to start thinking about different forms of hierarchy that we would expect in data. And that's in particular what I'm interested in, or one thing I'm interested in is hierarchy. So on the left is one form of hierarchical structure, which you might call compositional hierarchy maybe, where, say, a dog is made up of a head and a body, and the head is in turn made up of ears and snout and other things. And this could be thought of as a form of input space structure, because we take our input features and we have some hierarchical decomposition that we can partition them in a particular way that will apply to all the input samples. We might also be interested in a distributional hierarchy. And so here we have, say, the set of all objects, and that might be kind of related to the bitter lesson that has been mentioned a few times, is that if we have a general purpose learning system, such as a neural network, that has no built-in knowledge about the right features to use, then its input representation is going to be arbitrary. So if we don't have any handcrafted knowledge about the right representation to use to solve the problem, then whatever the input representation we're going to use could be anything. And so we're going to reflect this assumption by assuming the data has a random format with no informative structure about the learning task. So it's homogeneous, isotropic, and in fact, it will be scale invariant for this model.
Can you elaborate on what
Yeah. So the inputs, you have some special features. So here's an example of something that this wouldn't mean. So like if you have some, tabular data set, for example, that's like sales per month and number of customers and like different meaningful features, you've pre-processed your data set into a meaningful representation that you already have the right features that you use to solve the problem. If you have a general purpose learning system, the task that you're solving could be anything. You don't know what the right input encoding is. You have to learn that. And so that's the idea here, is that we don't start with the right decomposition of features, but with essentially an arbitrary one, which we'll model here as a random one.
So
Yes.
So random means there are no features, so random means that there are features, but hidden or dependent task. What's random means?
Yeah. So I'll in the next slide I'll say exactly how operationalize random, but that's right. So the input features are like homogeneous; they're arbitrary. So it'll be a statistical model. So there will be features that we can recover, but not a priori from the embedding. Yeah, so here's this specific model. So the idea here is we have our data space, which we'll think of as a high-dimensional hypercube, which we discretize into a lattice. And from our first assumption, we'll say, from this context-dependent assumption, for adjacent elements in this data space, we'll say that they have a bond if the target function that's being computed at those 2 points is approximately the same. So it's not that the target value is necessarily the same at those 2 points, but that the function is the same. So we have a chain of functional equivalents. And in general, if you have many elements that are all connected, this forms a cluster, where at all of those points in the cluster, they're all computing the same function. And so we can already say from this idea of something interesting, which is that an element that's in a cluster is in distribution, because it's learnable by generalization from other data points in its cluster. Whereas if an element is not in a cluster, we could say it's out of distribution because there's no other points to learn its function from. You have to just memorize its value. And then the second assumption we're going to operationalize by saying that this cluster pattern is effectively random. And so we'll say that we have some probability P, that there's a bond between 2 sites, and that is the fraction of pairs that are connected. And so the data model is the d-dimensional lattice that has bonds randomly appearing between adjacent elements with probability P.
So a bit confused by this first. Isn't this symmetric with respect to I and J, and then I of xi would have to be equal to phi of xj?
This is saying that if you apply these 2 points there's a point and a point and a function and a function. If you apply these 2 functions to the first point, that has the same behavior. If you apply the 2 functions to the second point, then that has the same behavior. Okay, and yes.
So the 2 functions should agree on each form. So there's not any relation between the functions.
The 2
Xi, j, xi.
Let's see. Your question is?
So I'm trying to understand the embed bomb. So we have a pair of functions agree on the point x.
Yeah, at that point.
Which point? So there is no relation between xi and xj.
They are here. We're assuming this idea. Yes.
Look at 2 equations.
xi and xj are just 2 points that are next to each other.
And the only relation between so the fact that they're next to each other is coming from the structure, nothing to do with the function.
Correct. Correct. So you were saying for every pair of points that are next to each other, we have a function that's at each point, and we say, are those two functions, do they behave the same way at these two particular points?
They're not. Fi xi, fj xi. So the two functions should agree on a point rather than between them. I think this is wrong.
Let's see. There's at each point xi, there's a function there.
Two functions, fj and fi.
Yeah. So each point has a function associated with it, but this is a function, so you could apply it to any point.
There are two functions, fi and fj.
Correct. So
Two functions.
each point has one function, but that function is just a function. You could apply it to any input that you want. So you could apply each function to any of the other points. That's what's happening here. So fi just denotes the function that exists at point I, xi, but at its neighbor, xj, there's another function there, and you can also just take that and give it any argument. So you could give that the argument xi. That's all that's being said here. Yes. So, right. Anyway, so yes. So we have the setup is a high-dimensional lattice with random bonds or sites. It's actually not going to change any of the analysis. And we have a theory that tells us the properties of clusters of randomly connected units on a lattice, which is called percolation theory. And this is used in a number of different contexts as a physical model in physics and material sciences. It comes up in network theory. It's also studied, different aspects are studied in math. And the most important thing to know, and why it's called percolation, is that there's a critical phase transition. There's some critical occupation probability, PC, above which there's an infinite cluster that emerges, and it's called that because it scales with the size of the system. So as you make the system bigger, this cluster gets larger the same way, and we say that that cluster percolates. Below criticality, there's only a distribution of disconnected finite clusters. There is no infinite cluster. And so in fact, here, because we're in high dimensions, we can use the mean field approach to analyze the structure of these clusters. Mean field, the word comes up a lot, and here just means there's some kind of interactions that we can neglect, and that simplifies the problem. In percolation, that means that the clusters don't self-intersect, so there's no cycles, and they look like trees, and that's how we can analyze them. And so we can analyze a cluster on this lattice as a cluster on an infinite infinite tree, which is called a beta lattice. And another property that we'll end up using is that it turns out there's a number of interesting relations between these mean field percolation clusters and different mathematical models, such as branching processes and random labeled trees in combinatorics. So we can I can just tell you a bunch of known results because this is a well understood branch of theory. So the statistics of these clusters, so below criticality or up to criticality, the size distribution is a power law. And in the mean field, there's an exponent here, which is 5/2. And as you get below criticality, there's an exponential cutoff in these cluster sizes. Above criticality, we're just going to be dominated by the infinite cluster, and we don't really care about the finite clusters anymore. And there's also very interesting geometric properties of these clusters. So these are fractal objects. They have some intrinsic fractal dimension. For these mean field clusters, that is dimension 4. And at criticality, this is a self-similar system. So we have the same geometry for all cluster sizes and length scales. And as we get far above criticality, then this infinite cluster, its geometry will revert to Euclidean.
In what dimension?
In the ambient dimension, lower, which I've been calling, which is lowercase d here.
You start with the Euclidean space.
Yeah. So like a hypercubic lattice, but yeah.
But do you require that like the real world's percolation, say probability is like 2 really close to criticality?
So good. I'll discuss that in the talk. And yes, we will assume that, but I'll explain why. But essentially, a selection effect for efficient learning. Okay, so now I'll talk about some applications of this model. So one key observable about neural networks that we've already heard about, probably will hear more again, is neural scaling laws, that as you increase the size of the neural network, the number of parameters or the data set size, the performance increases in an apparently predictable way following a power law. But it's not exactly fully known why this occurs. And there's a few different ideas that people have based on different aspects of data that might be used to explain this. So one idea is this idea of manifold approximation, where we say that we have some continuous function that's supported on a manifold of some low intrinsic dimension. If that's the case, then for a non-parametric function approximator, such as a neural network, then the loss will scale with an exponent inversely proportional, not to the ambient dimension, but to the intrinsic dimension. And so here in this plot, which thank you for Eric, which is taken from him, here is a linear interpolation, and as the linear interpolation of this function, as the grid scale becomes finer and finer, the loss will decrease as a power law. And so this is it's a very nice model, and one thing I like is that it connects the model performance to the scale and geometric properties of the data. One reason why we might not be fully convinced is that it's unclear how this story about continuous scaling would give us this idea from interpretability that a neural network has like discrete circuits and algorithms that are computing a bunch of distinct tasks. And so another idea that is thought about, and this also is due to Eric, which is that there might be an intrinsic power law distribution of features in the data. And so here the idea is the data distribution consists of some atomic features, which could also be called quanta, because due to their discreteness, with a heavy-tailed distribution. So their frequency of use or their importance in general decreases as a power law. And so you could learn like the most important feature, then the second most important feature, and so on in that order. And then your scaling laws will recapitulate this intrinsic power law distribution. And in this percolation model, we naturally recover both of these scaling stories. So we have a power law distribution at criticality of these percolation clusters, and each giving us this power law feature distribution. And each cluster is a fractal object with some low fractal dimension. And so from this model, we naturally recover these low dimensional representations of power law distributed features.
So minus what is tau then?
Tau is the exponent of the scaling law. It's the exponent of the cluster size distribution. And it's 5 halves for the mean field. And here is just a plot showing if you then predict what scaling laws you would expect by learning this model where we have this power law features, but each one is a low dimensional manifold, then this black line is the theoretical predictions, as the blue points are simulations using a nearest neighbor regression model, and that they agree. Okay, good. So now I'll move on to something that I'm thinking a bit more actively about now, which is how can this model be applied to interpretability and tell us about the kinds of features that we might expect to recover. So first I'll say maybe just at a high level what kinds of features we expect to see, and then the last part I'll talk about progress towards concretely simulating this and training models. So a conjecture that we could make is that in this percolation model, we have one free parameter, which is this occupation probability P. And as we vary that parameter, different percolation regimes give us different data models. So starting at the far left, if you have P far below criticality, then this corresponds to just disconnected points. So essentially random data. It doesn't admit any real generalization and must just be memorized. As you increase the probability where you're in the slightly subcritical regime, we now have a
where it comes from?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the dimension of the embedding space.
Only?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And it could also depend on the details of the particular lattice used. And then at a high level, can we use this model to tell us anything about the types of features that we would expect to see? And these would be the features that we'd expect models to learn to best map the data distribution to predict it. So I would argue that there's two main kinds of features we would expect to see. The first might be called context features, those that identify clusters and subclusters and so on. And this is self-similar, so you expect a hierarchy of these context features at increasingly fine levels of abstraction. At some point, you have a finite model and a finite data set, and you hit like the lowest level that you're able to resolve. At that point, you just need to predict whatever target values that you need to predict. And so you could call those component features that compute whatever the cluster's function is that you can no longer resolve explicit structure for. And so here, because these clusters are of fractal dimension 4, we make the generic prediction that we expect to see multidimensional features at some level of intrinsic dimension 4. And this is not supposed to be exhaustive. You'd expect to see things, for example, what I've called surface features here, like any sort of surface level heuristics that are used by a model that don't relate to any semantic content. That certainly is likely to occur. Internal features, things that just do some intermediate computations or handle like the tokenization and the output projections and things like that. And another sorts of thing you might want to think about is, could there be also general purpose mechanisms that are applied for any input, regardless of this the whatever task it is, something like induction or self-knowledge that always applies. And I've thought a bit about that, but I won't be discussing it. Yes.
The 4 is coming from the calculation from the cluster dimension, increasing dimension, the 4.
Yeah, so
it's a very strong prediction.
Yes.
Increasing the measure of free data, interesting data will be 4.
So for each cluster, but there's also this distribution of clusters, and that's harder to relate because we now have this distribution of different clusters, each of which should be 4, but recovering that from actual data is not easy to do. And yes, it is a strong prediction, and that's one reason that I'm excited about this model, that it can make not just, I'm talking a bit about like these high-level qualitative things, but it also makes specific quantitative predictions. That one thing I'm excited to is test them.
Does this model admit, like, can you, if you want it to not be 4, can you make it not 4?
Yeah, so this applies to the critical regime, which is all my work has focused on. If you say you're in the slightly supercritical regime, you expect the dimension to increase. And so if you're in the supercritical regime, then you start to recover again this more normal idea of we just have one manifold of data which has some dimension, but it's not explicitly predicted what the dimension is. All right, so, okay, good. So, all right, good. So I'll talk now about the ongoing work that I'm doing at Principles of Intelligence, which is taking this model and developing synthetic data sets that reflect this, and with the idea being, can we generate self-similar data sets that are self-consistent at a range of scales, and then using this as a benchmark for interpretability studies. So it's like a property of the world that the more you investigate something, the more you look into it, the more that you learn, the more detail that there is. There's always more detail. There's always more to learn. And we want to reflect that property of the world in our toy model. And I wrote here, the more you look, the more you see. And so we want to have a model where we want to represent the same data distribution, but viewed at any fine-grained scale. And so in such a way that it's self-consistent, that if you look at more detail, it still is consistent with the original coarse-grained representation, and it's also self-similar, that all of these distributional and geometric properties that I mentioned still hold as you do this. And not just in a theoretical way, but in a concrete way that we can actually implement efficiently to generate a large-scale synthetic data that we can use for empirical studies. So the naive approach for doing this of instantiating some high-dimensional lattice and then populating it with sites is completely intractable. You'll immediately run into the curse of dimensionality. So that can't be done. So to do this, you need to be clever and use particular properties of the data. And here I'll do so by sticking to the critical mean field model where we have a power law distribution of tree-like clusters. The first part about generating the power law distribution is fairly straightforward. Here we can take our clusters and pick a cluster to increment by 1 proportional to its size, or with some probability create a new cluster. And this just yields us, we can just solve for what that probability is, and we get the power law size distribution that we expect following like a preferential attachment process. But the hard part is, how do we fine-grain a cluster, thinking about it as a geometric object, not just some thing that's of size whatever, and in such a way that we both keep its structure self-consistent and maintain these distributional statistics of percolation clusters at all scales as we do this. And so the way that I found to proceed is by making use of this connection between mean field percolation clusters and random labeled trees, where that is just simply if you have n vertices connected by edges without any cycle, that's a random, and they have some labels, that's a random labeled tree. And there's this very elegant work in combinatorics called coalescent random forests, which shows that there's a deep connection between random trees and a growth process known as additive coalescence. So if you take a random tree and delete its edges one by one uniformly at random, then this will give you a forest of subtrees, and the sizes of those subtrees are those that, or it's the same as those of the clusters in an additive coalescent process. So here, if you have a bunch of, say, I guess droplets in this case, if you have a bunch of droplets and they merge one by one with a probability that's proportional to the sum of their sizes, that's additive coalescence. In general, you could have just coalescence with any arbitrary kernel. And if you have this merger process, this will give you this binary merger tree. And so we can build on this result to construct a percolation cluster hierarchically with an associated hierarchical decomposition of this binary tree associated with the cluster itself. So there's two trees. There's the percolation cluster, which is a random labeled tree, and we also have this binary hierarchical tree, which I think of as the tree of latent features. We can build on that result to construct an algorithm that's has the same behavior as the one proposed by Pittman, but can be implemented efficiently. So it's I call the cyclic coalescence. So we start with n randomly labeled nodes on a cycle, and each of these nodes is just a trivial subtree. And so the procedure is, on every iteration, you pick one of the nodes at random, and then you connect it to another random node in the successor subtree of its subtree. So here, like the first step, we've picked 0, and then that merges with 1. And then in the second step, or in this step, we pick 1 that has to merge with 2. Here, 4 merges with 5. And in this one, 3 is picked, but you can pick either 4 or 5 uniformly random, and that one connects to 5. And here, 5 is picked randomly, and that happens to merge with any of these 3, but in particular, it merges with 2. So does that make sense? So by the end of this process, in fact, you recover a random labeled tree, and the sequence of these merges corresponds to a binary hierarchical decomposition. And because of this cyclic implementation, we can implement it in effectively linear time. So that gives us a random tree or a random cluster at a particular scale. But what I want to do is go a step farther and fine-grain that to any scale indefinitely. And we can, again, use this by making use of this connection with additive coalescence. So in this binary tree, the size distribution, so every node of this binary tree has some number of descendant leaf nodes, and those sizes of the internal nodes have the distribution given by coalescence. And so what we want to do to fine-grain the tree is we will traverse this tree, and at every step we can go left or right, so we can either go into one subtree or the other subtree. And we just pick the probability of doing that, and it's Markovian, so all we care about is the size of that current node and the current split. And we can define whichever probability to go left or right, so that by the end of doing this whole process, we'll recover the right statistics for an additive coalescent process as if the original size had been greater by 1. And so after we do this, we'll get the right statistics for that everything is preserved. We can compute this exactly using the known distributions and also approximate it efficiently. And there's one more step, which is that when we add a new node, we need to preserve the original probability that when we picked which node to attach to uniformly at random, we now increase the new node. Now there has to be some probability that all of these other edges had connected to it. So it maintains this idea of having been connected uniformly at random. And so what we do is, with some small probability, we rewire existing edges to the new node if they were in its subtree. And that probability goes like 1 over the number of nodes. So as the size of a subtree gets bigger and bigger, the probability that its edge that will rewire to any new node gets smaller and smaller.
So, first of all, thank you for this very interesting talk. Just one question: why should we talk about binary trees here? I mean, in natural languages, I think more common is decisional process. So you have non-product children is like kind of dynamically determined depending on that at which level of the tree. Well, why do you choose binary tree? Is it because of sampling would be efficient? Or?
Because it has this exact connection to the random label trees.
How does it connect to this in hierarchical research process? Is there any connection? Pittman later wrote, this paper, right? Pittman wrote distributions, I think, a little bit later, 2-3 years after.
So these random trees are very rich structures. I mentioned they're all connected to all these different things. So there's many other connections that exist with these random label trees. This is one of them that I'm making use of.
Okay.
For example, what I'm talking about. So on the left is the original tree, the right is the fine-grained tree, and here this is the corresponding relations hierarchy. So by this particular example, so each of these purple nodes corresponds to a particular subtree of this tree. If you follow the human, you'll see that sounds correct, that the top one will pop us 4, and you see the rest, and so on and so forth. So here we
followed a particular path down the tree, and you'll notice that this is has a preferential attachment character to it. You're more likely to go into a subtree that's already larger. And we'll end up here, and so we've ended up in this node that was originally 7 and 0, and so we've kicked out 0, we've created a new node 24, and we now add a new node 12, which is definitely going to be attached to 0, but we didn't end up rewiring anything else. And then here, that corresponds that there's a new node 12, which is attached to 0. We can also, there's some chance that something else will rewire. So here's just this, now it's like seed 0, this is seed 1. So now we go down a path, and here we end up getting down to this path of latent node 14, which connected 6 and 7. And so we add a new node, 12 connected to 7, but also we're going to rewire this edge, which originally connected 6 to 7. Now, whoop, it's going to connect 6 to 12. And that indeed corresponds to what we see here, that this one got deleted between 6 and 7. Now 6 attaches to 12, and also 12 attaches to 7. And with small probability, you might have many such rewirings, but always in a way that respects this latent hierarchy. And so here I found an example where there's a few different rewirings, and if you trace through this tree, you'll see that several edges got split, but still in accordance with this latent hierarchy, and reconnect to the new node 12. So here, you go ahead. Yeah, so here's just an animation showing a process of generating a tree for like 100 nodes in accordance with this. And so the idea here is we can use this latent hierarchy as a ground truth to assign the target values for all of the points and that we have in our cluster, and we embed this cluster into some high-dimensional vector space. And so we can then train neural networks on the data and use this hierarchical decomposition of latents as a known source of the variables that we expect to recover, because that will completely determine your performance on the learning task. So let's see how we're doing. Okay, so all right, I'll just skip to the next slide. All right, I think this is the last slide actually. So this is a preliminary result of recovering latent features from a neural network trained on a percolation data set. This is actually trained on an older version of the data set, so it's a little out of date. And these are experiments done by my colleague Tom Carlson in the data models group at Princeton, who unfortunately couldn't make it. But basically here, he trained a small MLP network on the data, and then trains linear probes to recover the values assigned to those latent variables for every latent. So here on the left is training to recover just the sum of latent values up to some depth in the tree. Good. And then on the right is just the specific value for that particular latent node. So the main just high-level takeaways here are that as you go deeper in the network, the performance of these probes increases, so you recover more of the values for the latents, so you recover the deeper latents, and that as you go deeper in this tree, the performance will decrease here. Doesn't quite get to 0, but very close to 0. And so that also makes sense that you recover best the higher up latents in the tree. So I'll end here. So in conclusion, I would argue that data models should be a key tool for ambitious interpretability. And I'm interested in a particular model based on high-dimensional percolation that very naturally, without explicitly assuming any of this, gives us realistic properties of natural data sets, sparsity, hierarchy, low dimensionality, and power laws. And what I'm interested in exploring now is if we can use self-consistent, self-similar synthetic data sets to unlock new validation methods for interpretability tools. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So I was expecting to see Paul.
Sorry?
Paul on that slide in the previous.
Oh. So let's see. I guess I don't want to. This.
Paul, I mean, I thought that the whole point, the enterprise, is to with some latent self-singularity, but
this is, I guess, this is highly preliminary. So, yeah, that's the goal. Yeah.
So can you actually elaborate the last point in the conclusion? Like,
yeah.
Because I'm kind of struggling to see how you go in this to, let's say, some realistic setting. So it's like, what's the pathway you say to deploy these tools to some,
Yeah.
or a task?
Well, I think one very simple application is that this is like a benchmark for interpretability tools. So if you're going to argue that your new SAE variant, for example, is going to recover features well, then this is a data set that has many properties that we think that the real features should have. So it's just a one benchmark for training tools. That would be a very simple thing. Another, I guess, direction that I'm interested in is here we can use this fact that we have this like self-similarity property to define an intrinsic scale of the data that you could use as a metric for the recovery of your interpretability method. So you could, there's a trade-off, for example, like do you resolve the biggest clusters very well, but miss the smaller clusters? Do you resolve more of the clusters at a lower level of granularity? So you could quantify this kind of trade-off in a very controlled setting.
Okay, so let's see. Would you say that the following is correct? So that all of this provides you with some tool, you do a zeroth order test on interpretability tools, provided that those assumptions we made on what we would like the data to be are actually true.
Yeah, definitely. So one, I didn't mention in this talk because it's ongoing work, but one other direction that we're interested in is empirical tests of data to try to see how well models like this or other ones fit real data sets. This, of course, that's definitely the assumption.
Right. How costly is the assumption?
How costly?
It's how realistic is it? Can you actually evaluate that?
I depends on what level. Are you saying the qualitative properties that I mentioned in the talk, like things like sparsity and hierarchy, power laws, low dimensionality? I mean, I feel very confident that at some level those are definitely true, and this is a reasonable model that gives you all of those things. In terms of specific, quantitative fits, then no, I don't have evidence. That's one thing that I would be very interested in exploring further. Yeah.
So do I understand correctly that the only tunable parameter here is D, the ambient dimension?
Well, D is not, it doesn't have any meaningful effect because you're just in the mean field. So the only tunable parameter that remains after that is this occupation probability, P. So yes,
Criticality, then it's set.
That is correct.
Wait, so when you have this percolation model of data and you're sort of clustering them, this is some sort of strong assumptions on the model that you have, because the bonds between data would be determined by the shrink parameter based on posterior is the losses, again, until elliptic parameterized Hamiltonian, they perturb these parameters. It's going to tell you about how these data points actually couple. So by putting saying that there's some intrinsic dimension D, sort of says that there's some intrinsic dimension Frankfurt, model class you have that you have to be over this intrinsic dimension, or else we just can't represent this then, because the data has this sort of fundamental coupling that you need to actually capture the structure. Is this sort of this is a bit?
I'm not sure if I would know exactly the details to answer that specific question, but I would say that any model that you have would have to be able to represent this form of data in order to capture the structure.
So I guess what I'm saying is in some sense this puts a representational class, it's almost like a universality thing. This dimension D, any sort of thing, you have this percolation cluster, the model actually has to be able to capture that in some sort of sense, right?
Yes.
When you express something advanced correctly, we would expect that the Bayesian and posterior, sort of any model that's this data would in some sense share the same sort of internal structure with other models also.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, the dimension D is one property that we would expect certainly to transfer from the data to the representations in the model.
Universal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just thinking about this from a high level words view. In a hierarchical thing, you have dogs, and you have the Dalmatian. This is something. Well, like, a Dalmatian is also a subset of like a spot, right? So, I think in real data, things can have two ancestors. And that would not be hierarchical. It would be like a little bit more beyond.
Yeah, so that's one extension that I'm very interested in exploring. And I think that is, here we're at criticality where we have these distinct clusters, and you get slightly super critical. Now these clusters can have cycles, and in turn that would reflect in, you can have multiple ancestors in this tree. So it wouldn't be a pure hierarchy, but some sort of DAG, and that would be a model for these compositional latent features. And that's something that I'm very interested in, but is much analytically less tractable. Yeah.
Yeah, so the process which produces text in our world, which like the most interesting kind of data, which is like human minds thinking. So like this is about the structure of data, but can you say anything, or do you have any kind of like conceptual picture about what this story might be saying about like the structure of mind?
Well, one thing I think that we could say about the structure of minds, it relates to this idea of we're near criticality in this representation. And that's partly a function of the structure that exists in the world, but it's also partly a question of what is learnable. And so we're saying that we have this critical representation with hierarchy, for example, because that is the part of the world that we can actually learn. So it's all well and good to say there's more structure out there. P is like super critical, but that has to be filtered out through some process to get any sort of, not just a data set, but I would say also what's in our own minds as well, because we have learned it from the world and we're not magical.
In a model, you're having edges stranded between points of the line that's thought about having high dimensional faces, and that would be interesting.
So adding
Faces of your grids of different dimensions, different probabilities.
I haven't thought too deeply about different ways to extend the lattice structure, but this is one area where we were saying before, there's no free parameters. Yeah, you could start to think about other extensions as well. So yeah, there's definitely, this is like the simplest model, but that's the one on, yeah.
So, everything is maybe to digital or but let's say you have multiple training data that you build according to the two different class parameters, like being differentiation, and like and you know a world where there are different modalities for like different kind of data with different maybe models for like toy models that kind of actually look to like what that this structure is data is, and we kind of trade these big models to do. So my question for like could you use these kind of data benchmarks to see like there are sort of pattern data representation that are different according to different structure, and if you are training a mixture of them, if you're able to take up the type of that, will they just cut as them to level up to the representation?
Yeah, that's definitely some sort of thing that I'm interested in with this data set. So here we have this like latent representation, and then that gives us like a graph, and then we can also embed that in many ways and assign particular values to these latents in many ways. And at each level, like you can just reseed that, and you get something that has at this deep core the same structure, but at a superficial level, different structures. You can keep going with the embedding here. Everything is just like vectorized data, but you could think about like taking this vector and using it to, parameterize some other modality. And so this could be a model for, how do you recover like these deeper internal representations and disentangle that from these more increasingly surface level parts of the model. Yeah, that's
Right, so maybe we put two icons found they use static filter
the later part, since the only important parameter is P, which is not related to the bounding process. So actually, imagine this bounding process because all the deployment that you talk here, all that.
Oh, yeah. So that bonding probability is would be directly parameterized by P. So that's like the same parameter.
Yes.
Because here we're just modeling the lattice as one overall statistical parameter, which is this probability. We're just saying it's IID. And and here like the probability of two things be connected is like the specific instance of that. So that's controlled statistically by P, if that makes sense.
How do you the guidance talk though? Should